Task 3. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that schools could no longer be segregated or divided by race. Many people were not happy about the court ruling and they fought integrated school. Some people, like members of a group called the Ku Klux Klan, were violent and tried to prevent blacks from having equal rights. Many other white people, while not violent, opposed integration as well. Other white people supported equality for blacks, and some worked along with blacks to gain civil rights. Next slide. In December of 1955, something important happened in Montgomery, Alabama. A black woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. She was arrested. The black citizens of the city were outraged and they decided to protest. They refused to ride city buses. This kind of protest, in which people refuse to participate in something in order to force a change, is called a boycott. It is a peaceful means of protest. King became the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, which went on for over a year. The city would not change the segregation law. Many threats were made to King's family, and once their house was bombed. In 1956, the boycott ended in victory when the Supreme Court ruled that Alabama could no longer segregate riders on buses. Next slide. Still, violence against African Americans continued in the South. Several churches in Montgomery, Alabama were bombed. Martin spoke out saying, "We will not hate you, but we will not obey your evil laws." Courageous blacks started to test the unfair laws. In 1960, a small group began sit-ins at lunch counters where only white people could be served. A sit-in is another form of peaceful protest. During the sit-ins, angry white people would often push or beat the black people for sitting in their seats. But the sit-ins were successful. By the end of the year, more than 100 southern towns had integrated their lunch counters. Next slide. The next year, a group of black and white Americans called the Freedom Riders rode together on buses through the southern states. They wanted to test the new law banning segregation. When they got to Alabama, violent gangs of Southerners, including members of the KKK, burned the buses and attacked the riders. The local police didn't offer much protection, and many people were hurt. Finally, the federal government in Washington, D.C. sent in 500 U.S. troops to put a stop to the violence. Next slide. In April 1963, King helped organize protests and marches in Birmingham, Alabama, to stop segregation in the city. During one protest, the marchers were met by Police Chief Bull Connor and his men. Attack dogs were set loose on the marchers, even on children. The marchers were sprayed with high-pressure fire hoses. Many were seriously injured. More than 3,000 African Americans were arrested and jailed. President Kennedy sent U.S. troops to Birmingham to stop the violence. Television and newspaper reports of the violence made more people aware of the unfair and harsh treatment of African Americans. It brought more attention to the need for equal rights for all people. Finally, the city ended its segregation laws.